Now, as mentioned, large language models in the end are neural networks. And neural networks are in the end just machine learning models, computer programs, you could say, that connect a vast amount of input and calculation nodes organized across multiple layers to then produce an output. Now, there are different kinds of neural networks for different purposes. For example, if you would be training some AI model for working with images, you would often work with so-called convolutional neural networks. But for working with text, the state-of-the-art type of neural networks are so-called transformers or transformer neural networks. Now, the idea behind such a large language model neural network is that in the end you train this network, this model, such that for given inputs, for given text, it produces outputs, words, that produce logically sound sequences of words. And this is done through a very long iterative training process where words are fed in and outputs are then compared to the input words to see if the overall sequence makes sense. Now, in case of the GPT 3.5 model, which is one model that is available through ChatGPT, there were more than 170 billion parameters organized across 96 layers used in that neural network to create this GPT model. Now, the exact technical details are definitely not important for this course and not important in order to use ChatGPT. What is important, though, is to simply understand and be aware of the fact that these GPT models are quite complex models that complete sequences of words and predict words based on billions of parameters. So as you can tell, these large language models indeed, are large. They do use complex neural networks. But as I mentioned before, the idea behind such neural networks is to feed in data and then get output data, and then to optimize the neural network by simply checking if that output data makes sense. And that brings up one other question. What exactly was that data that was used for training? And the answer is, everything. Basically, the entire publicly available text data from the entire internet. So not just the English language, but all kinds of languages, which also explains why ChatGPT can be used for translating text or for asking questions in non-English languages. And therefore, of course, since basically the entire internet text was used, ChatGPT, of course, knows a lot of patterns and received a lot of input data. Though I will, of course, say that some parts of the text available in the internet were removed from the training data to reduce the danger of these GPT models to produce or generate malicious or dangerous content. So a lot of training data was used, but it's worth knowing that for training those models, it were actually not the human readable words that were being used for training, but instead those words were translated to so-called tokens, where every token has its own unique ID. Now, these tokens aren't necessarily always entire words. Instead, you can roughly say that 75 words can be broken up into roundabout 100 tokens. And it's these tokens and their IDs that are being used as inputs for these neural networks, so to train these models, these large language models. Technically, there are more transformations and things going on behind the scenes, but that's really not too important for this course and for using ChatGPT. Instead, as you will also see later, it's just important to be aware of this tokens concept. So these GPT models, these large language models, are pretty complex. They received lots of input data, and that's what makes them so powerful. But in the end, that's really important, they are about predicting words. They are about completing sequences by, for example, predicting that for a sentence like this, nice might be the next word that should be added. So every word that's being output by ChatGPT is being predicted based on the words in front of that word. Now that's happening super fast here, but in the end, it's a word-by-word process. So in the end, under the hood, ChatGPT continuously takes a look at the words it output thus far, or the words that were sent as an input by the user, and it then generates possible next words. It assigns possibilities to those words, and it then typically picks the word that has the highest probability. So that, for example, here it could determine that nice makes sense for this sentence, but rich and close might not make too much sense. Those might make more sense in other sentences, but not in this sentence. Now, what's important to understand about this word prediction that's performed by ChatGPT is that the predicted word, nice, for example, is not just based on the word directly in front of the word that's being predicted, but instead these GPT models are able to understand more complex sequences and relations. For example, the GPT models would be able to understand that nice makes sense here because it's related to the weather, not to the word very. If it were just be looking at the word very, rich or close might make sense, but if you take the overall sentence into account, nice of course makes much more sense because, as mentioned here, it would be related to the weather. So the GPT models are able to understand complex relations like this because these models are so complex and have so many input parameters. And therefore, these models are also not just related to single sentences, but instead they can predict the words based on relations across multiple sentences or more complex word combinations. And that's why ChatGPT can seem so magical. It looks as if it really understands what we're saying. But in the end, it's really important to keep in mind that it is just predicting words based on the context it has available. So based on the user input and all the words it generated up to this word it's currently predicting. It's all about word prediction, but because of the complexity of these GPT models, it's able to predict these words really well, and it's able to produce complex output and complex text like this one here. So ChatGPT is based on these GPT models, which are in the end large language models, which are these complex neural networks consisting of billions of parameters and dozens of layers. They were trained with huge data sets, almost the entire publicly available text from the internet. But it's worth noting that the final product of this neural network training process in the end just is a pre-trained model, which would be capable of predicting words, but which is not necessarily optimized and fine-tuned for the exact use case where it should be used. That's what happens through fine-tuning, another step during the training phase of these models. So OpenAI did not just build and train that neural network, instead they then also applied fine-tuning to the pre-trained model to produce the final polished and finished GPT model. Now, fine-tuning is in the end all about optimizing the pre-trained model for a specific use case. So, for example, for using it to build this chat-like application. It's this fine-tuned model that's therefore used by ChatGPT, and it's therefore this fine-tuned model with which you, the user, in the end interact when you send your prompts and you get back those responses, the generated output. Though it's also worth noting that technically, when using ChatGPT, all your prompts are first sent to a moderation API owned and maintained by OpenAI, which checks your input and in the end ensures that certain kinds of questions can't be asked. And it's also likely that the output produced by ChatGPT, so by these GPT models, are also fed through that moderation API, so through that moderation program, you could say. Simply to make sure that both the input and the output are free from dangerous or malicious text, so that you, for example, can't ask how to build a bomb. Now that also leads us to the limitations of ChatGPT and these GPT models. When working with ChatGPT, certain kinds of inputs simply aren't allowed, because of this moderation program, which in the end scans all inputs and outputs before allowing them. But there also are some other limitations you should be aware of. For example, limited training data. As mentioned, a huge amount of data was used for training the model. But since training such a complex model does indeed take very long, it actually takes multiple months to train such a model, training data has to be cut off at a certain point of time. For example, GPT 3.5 only has data until September 2021. So if you're asking questions that would require knowledge past September 21, ChatGPT would not be able to help you. At least unless you have access to ChatGPT plugins or ChatGPT with web search, which at this point of time is only available to ChatGPT Plus users. So if you do have a ChatGPT Plus subscription and you are using ChatGPT with web search capabilities, you can of course also ask questions or request responses that do need data past September 21, because ChatGPT should then be able to search the web. But without those capabilities, if you're, for example, only using the free version of ChatGPT or a model that does not have web browsing enabled, this cutoff date is one limitation you should keep in mind. In addition, it's also really important to keep in mind that even though these responses which you get from ChatGPT can seem very logical and magical, it's about patterns, not logic. As mentioned, ChatGPT predicts words. It assigns probabilities and picks words based on probabilities. It doesn't really understand you, even though it often seems like it does. You can sometimes see this when asking ChatGPT for the result of some mathematical calculation, especially when forcing it to give you just the result without any extra explanation. Since ChatGPT is no calculator and can't do any logical thinking, it's just trying to predict a word, in this case a number, based on some probabilities. And therefore here, for example, it predicted 104, which is wrong. The answer, of course, would be 82. Now, by the way, chances are that if you're running this example, you get a different response, maybe even the right response, because ChatGPT, whilst using probabilities, also has a certain randomness factor built in so that it doesn't always generate exactly the same words. But either way, it can't think logically. It only predicts words based on probabilities combined with that slight randomness factor. Now, one other limitation you should be aware of is that ChatGPT, in its raw form, can only handle and output text. It can't search the internet and it can't execute code, for example. Now, I will say that this is not entirely true if you're using ChatGPT plugins. If you have access to it, indeed, you can enhance ChatGPT so that it, for example, could be able to actually perform web searches. But if it's just ChatGPT without those plugins, it's not able to do that. Later in the course, though, I will actually show you how you could enhance GPT, these GPT models, yourself with third-party tools. But out of the box, if you just have ChatGPT without plugins, it can really just predict and generate text. There's no built-in calculator, as you can see, and also no built-in web browser or search engine or anything like that.